At this point in the video series, you've already decided that classroom research is something that you want to take part in or pursue in your own classroom or at your own school. You've blocked some time off. You've reviewed your problem in a little bit more detail. You've looked at possible solutions, and you've picked out an intervention that you think will work for your students. Now is where the real work, that's not fair. This is where the research part of it, no, that's not fair either. Research has already been ongoing. If you've done all those steps, pat yourself on the back. But in order to see if your intervention is successful, you have to collect some sort of data in order to test the effectiveness of the intervention strategy. Or if you had a belief or a hypothesis that you were testing, evidence is how you subject the hypothesis to a test. So in this video, I'm just going to talk about the evaluation procedure. So hopefully you've implemented some sort of a strategy, or you have a plan to implement a strategy that's going to solve a problem. And now you don't want to rely on what you believe will happen or what you imagine is happening. You want to have some sort of objective or structured subjective form of evidence that you're collecting to evaluate whether or not what you do or what you've done is working. So the very first issue is that anybody can do a study that sucks. And forgive my crude way of putting this, but what I'm trying to point out here is that it's very easy to design a study that shows that what you've done works. So if you're not careful, the results you get may be meaningless. So for example, if I decide to throw out all of my lectures and just hand out worksheets at the beginning of each class and just sit in the front of the classroom, by the end of the semester, I can collect a lot of data that shows that learning happened, or students had a good time or a bad time, or there are parts of it that they liked, parts of it they didn't like, but I can focus on the obvious benefits. Students weren't bored by lectures, and I can ask them questions about, hey, so were you bored by my lectures? And they'd say no. And then I'd say, look, so you enjoyed not being bored? It's like, yeah. I can collect data that paints my strategy in a positive light. But that doesn't mean that students were better off with my intervention strategy. It doesn't mean that what I did was better than alternatives or was better than what I was doing previously. So you need to be very careful. And ultimately, if you are sincere in your question about whether or not an intervention is working, you're not going to have to worry about this step because you're going to be curious if it does work. You're not going to be defensively trying to hand pick the data that supports your hypothesis. So this is also a warning to you if you're reading research that's been conducted and it's all positively glowing and everything's like, oh wow, this worked brilliantly. Take a minute to wonder if the person who conducted the research was fair and honest and sincere with the data they collected and how they reported it, and so the analysis that was given. So I want to go through a couple of mistakes to avoid in order to prevent yourself from doing a study that sucks. So what are some mistakes that lead to sucky research? The first one is teacher bias. This is looking at your intervention with rose-colored glasses. You might want to address a behavioral management problem by spending time talking to certain problem students and building a relationship with them. And so maybe you come up with a series of questions to ask these students to kind of build some rapport. And then at the end of 8 weeks, you have what is to you evidence that a relationship has been built. And so like now the student addresses you by name, or you nod head, you sort of like acknowledge each other when you walk into the same classroom. You can pick out a bunch of data that for you, it seems like it's being effective, but ultimately we're not always the best judge of how well something is working, especially if we've got some skin in the game, so to speak. We have an investment. We don't want to believe that our investment was a waste of time or it was without purpose. And so we tend to see what we want to see, which is why you should always be skeptical of a research report that in which everything works out perfectly well. Even the best designed intervention strategies provide space for the instructor, for the teacher to learn something new about themselves, about their students, about the whole learning process. And it's disingenuous to suppose that everything worked out perfectly, no mistakes were made, and there was no room for improvement. So I guess when you're planning your evaluation, always keep in the back of your mind, is my bias, my hope that it's all working out or is going to work out, is that going to change my perception of the data? There are ways to avoid this, to not take any sort of play any role in the data collection or the data identification or analysis, so like kind of outsourcing it to a standardized procedure. But I don't think that length is necessary. Just keep this bias in mind. Maybe ask for a second opinion. That's when you can get inter-rater reliability to kind of control that. Or remove yourself from the analysis entirely and just share data and kind of let someone else do the assessment for you. That's actually how we handle it at my university. Which reminds me, I wanted to tell a story about sucky research. So at Albany State University, we had, or were required by the accreditation agency to do regular ongoing assessments of all learning programs, including general education. So I am the coordinator of general education at our university, but before I was hired, and the reason I was hired was because we failed our general education assessment. We collected a bunch of data, and the data all said things are working out, but we didn't collect very intentional data. We just collected kind of what you might call ad hoc data. It was after the fact. We weren't really assessing student achievement. We just like reached into existing classrooms and pulled out data and said, look, it's working. There wasn't any formal analytic process. And so the accrediting agency took one look at it and said, this doesn't count as assessment data. You're not really doing what you're supposed to be doing. So we had to redesign what ended up being a pretty complex assessment strategy, because we failed the doing a study that doesn't suck test. What up, dude? All right, so other mistakes that lead to sucky research. In that example, we committed number 3. So let me actually jump to number 3 here. We picked data that just made it look like we were doing a good job. We picked existing data that said students are learning what they're supposed to be learning, even though the questions that students were being asked and the contexts in which they were kind of giving their academic performances were contrived or didn't really match the learning objectives we were supposed to be assessing. So how might that work for you? Ideal sampling. If you were to assess whether or not students are learning a certain math skill, and you spent an entire day showing students how to solve 5 problems, and like you walked them through it, you like solved the problems for them, and the students just memorized what to do. They weren't actually solving the problems themselves. And then you gave them the same questions as your evaluation, and then students just like remembered what the answers were and wrote down their work, and you used that to test whether or not the evaluation worked. This is called teaching to the test, and it's why it is illegal to do. and there have been pretty heavy sanctions at school districts for doing something like this. Just because assessment outcomes or evaluation outcomes look promising doesn't mean that corners weren't cut or corners haven't been cut. So when you're designing your study, make sure, or you're designing your evaluation strategy, make sure you're careful with the kind of data you're selecting and how it might be influenced by other factors. In other words, don't cheat. Another example of this might be trying to build classroom morale or like emotional intelligence, and then picking a day when everyone's in a good mood. Maybe it's a Friday, maybe it's right before a holiday, and you're doing like your assessment. So, was my new classroom morale improvement strategy effective? Well, I just brought in a bunch of pizza. We're celebrating the end of the school year. Are you guys happy? And like, yeah. Well, that's not really a fair evaluation. So maybe taking a couple of climate checks throughout the school year would be, and then triangulating or averaging the results, that might be a little bit better. Okay, number 2, sorry, I'm jumping around here. Asking leading questions. You might, if you've ever watched like a crime show where criminal suspects are being interrogated, you know that certain questions can be asked in a way that makes the target answer more likely. So for example, instead of asking a student to report their perceived quality of a classroom activity, you might say, did you hate it? Did you absolutely hate it? Well, no, I didn't hate it. Okay, so you liked it. Liked it, right? And so you've set that question up to lead students to give you a specific answer. Ultimately, when you're looking at your evaluation strategy, make sure any result has equal likelihood of coming up. In other words, don't cheat. These all kind of end with don't cheat. Same thing with picking and choosing data. You might do an assessment one day to see if students learned this math skill and they bomb. So it's like, all right, I'm throwing that out. We'll do it again next week. And then, oh, they did really well. Well, that's the one I'm going to use. This, by the way, is illegal to do for testing medications in psychiatry, for example, and some pharmaceutical companies have been sued by the government for doing it, by the people, and then other companies have gotten away with it. It does happen sometimes, and it's not always obvious that it's happening. But we would like to know if a drug is effective or harmful before we take it. But if that data is hidden and only the positive results are shared, of course that's going to be suspicious. All right, so those are mistakes that you want to avoid. On to actual data. Perhaps it would have made more sense to begin with this slide. But what we're trying to do when we evaluate the effectiveness of an intervention is collect something that shows that a change has occurred. So it can be helpful to have baseline data. So if you're using test scores, for example, for students to learn a math skill, give them a baseline assessment to see where they're at on the skill level. Maybe they start off here, then at the end of the semester they're up here. Then you can justifiably say that there was an improvement during the semester, during the school year. But whether or not that improvement was due to your intervention would require controls, which is why the randomized controlled experiment is the Lexis of classroom intervention evaluation procedures. And we'll get into that in a later video on quantitative assessment or quantitative evaluations. Just know that having some sort of, in this example, objective evaluation figure can be helpful. You don't need to do pre-test, post-test, or baseline, and then after intervention evaluations. You might just show that, okay, at the end of the semester, their scores met the criterion to advance to their next grade, or you can even compare it to class averages from past semesters. There are things you can do with it. There are ways of analyzing the evidence. These are just examples of evidence. So test scores, what students are doing, so you can actually watch their behavior and maybe take you would need to like go through ethical approval for this, but like get video footage of something that's happening to kind of have evidence. You can invite someone in to observe the classroom, and what you might be looking for is classroom engagement or behavioral control, or like students are raising their hands, students aren't talking out of turn, if those are important measures. There were no emotional outbursts today, or there was only one emotional outburst today. You can look for specific behavioral cues, or even like present an issue where students may have to solve a problem and then watch for frustration and visible signs of that. You can look at work that students produce, so artifacts of learning. It can be a presentation, a poster, an essay, group work. Anything that they do can be possible evidence. You can even rely on your own observations. Just remember to avoid, or remember the possibility that you're going to be looking at what happens through rose-colored glasses. Or maybe if you don't expect an intervention to work, you're going to look for reasons why it doesn't work, even when there might be evidence to the contrary. Continuing this, you might use pre-existing assessments. So maybe an end of year exam. It could be like a standardized exam you submit to the state. Those can be useful if you have those scores. You can compare them. There's probably a lot of data to compare that to. Some standardized tests I'd put up there. Materials that students create for their presentations. You might even find that there's evidence that you didn't expect to collect. So maybe you try something new, an emotional intelligence activity. So students start to practice emotional intelligence skills, and then you get emails from parents saying, I don't know what you're doing in the classroom, but my son or daughter just asked me this, or had a really neat observation, or started doing something different that's benefited the family, or you might, or comments from other teachers, or where I put recess buzz, maybe like there's a new phenomenon happening at recess where students are talking about what's going on in the classroom, and so like you can use any of that as evidence. Just keep in mind all the problems that I mentioned earlier, and I think that's it. Yeah, so tons of ways to collect evidence, and I would recommend keep the options wide open. Don't limit yourself, because you may find new evidence that you weren't expecting to find. Just avoid picking and choosing evidence that supports the idea that your intervention was successful. So if you're looking for evidence that it worked, also be looking for evidence that it did not work. So always thesis, antithesis, synthesis, always combining positive and the negative to see a full look at the evidence. And if in doubt, invite someone else to participate in that process with you that doesn't have skin in the game, a dog in the fight, pick your metaphor, doesn't have something to gain or lose by the outcome of that study.